there might be a couple people that pop in on YouTube, but anyways, okay, I'll hit record and then I'll invite everyone in and we'll get going. Hi, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction and the host of the panel. This is a regular panel series that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. I'm excited for the panelists we have here today. Before I get into that, just a couple quick instructions. So all of you are able to toggle your cameras on or off if you'd like. It's totally your preference. I do have the settings so that you're not able to open your mics just to avoid any distractions. You can interact with us in the chat. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat bubble. Just click on that. It should open up a chat prompt in the right-hand side of the screen if you're on a desktop. Go ahead and say hello. Let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what you're reading right now. Anything at all, just go ahead and say hello. I want to thank everyone who is attending and registered for this. We really appreciate that you're here, and also thank you for those that made a contribution. This event is free, but I appreciate those that have made contributions because it helps really offset the cost of the Zoom platform and the Eventbrite platform, so we really appreciate that. I'm going to post a link in the chat to a landing page with our panelists' novels with more information about each novel, like the synopsis. It also has a link to bookshop.org. We support bookshop.org because anything you buy from Bookshop, they make a part of that sale go back to independent booksellers. So we want to support independent booksellers by selling the books through bookshop.org. And I'll post that link again later in the chat as you get to know these authors and their novels. Without further ado, I'm going to remove myself from the screen and we'll welcome our panelists. Jen Wright, let's start with you. If you could say hello and let us know about your novel, Last Light Over Galveston.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Jennifer Wright, and I am the author of 4 works of historical fiction. As Colin said, my last book, Last Light Over Galveston, just released last month, and it deals with the Great Galveston Storm of 1900, which coincidentally made landfall 125 years ago today. So that's pretty cool that this is happening on the anniversary of the storm.
Do you have the book within reach?
Yes, I sure do. It's right here.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Of course.
Next, let's go to Charles Bush, author of The Boy with the Jade, which is being published by us at History Through Fiction. Charles, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Hello. Well, The Boy with the Jade, it's historical fiction, and it's set in 18th century China. And it tells the story of a boy growing up in a wealthy, very powerful, wealthy, aristocratic family that unfortunately also happens to be chaotic and cruel a lot of the time. So.
Thank you, Charles. Next, Andrea, if you could say hello and let us know about The Last Witch of Boston, or First Witch.
Yes. I'm not sure who the last witch is. Probably still left to be determined. I'm Andrea Catalano, and yes, my first debut novel is called The First Witch of Boston, and it was released on September 1st. And it is the story of Margaret Jones, who was the first woman tried and executed for witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1648. It is based on John Winthrop's transcription of the trial in his diary and various court records that still exist.
Thanks, Andrea. I forgot to ask, and I see Charles has got some books behind him. I don't know if he has one within reach. Andrea, do you have one?
I don't. It's actually
Okay.
downstairs, and I can totally go and grab it. And I should have thought of that ahead of time, but I'm not organized. Sorry.
That's all right. I see Charles is grabbing his. There it is, A Boy with a Jade. Thank you, Charles.
Beautiful cover, thanks to Colin's designer.
Yeah, her name is Christine, the book cover whisperer. She does excellent work. Although I think she's moving away from cover design, so I was gonna, I want to plug her work, but I think she's moving into teaching now. Finally, let's bring on Barbara, who's the author of Isabella's Way. I have oh, nobody can see me. I'm not on screen. I have the book right here, but Barbara, if you could say hello and let us know
So do
about your
I.
novel. There you go.
So this is Isabella's Way, and it is my third novel, my second historical novel. Um, and it is the story of a 14-year-old embroideress who has to find her way from Portugal through Spain and France to Germany to escape the Spanish Inquisition. She does not know for much of the novel that her embroidery is being used to assist a clandestine network of safe houses. She has a lot of allies and a lot of people pursuing her. So it's kind of a coming of age adventure historical.
Thanks, Barbara. Well, let's start with Jen. If you could just give us a little background for the Galveston hurricane of 1900. What made it so destructive? And I'm also a little bit curious, how does it compare to some of the more modern storms?
I think it's easy to say that it was a product of its time. It was 1900. We obviously we didn't have the technology of the weather forecasting that's available to us today. But, unfortunately, the effects of the hurricane, the causes of them were a little bit more complicated than that. So at the time, the best scientific minds, they believed it was impossible for a hurricane to strike the Gulf Coast. This was a consensus. They all believed this. They believed that because of the laws of physics, any hurricane that entered the Gulf would curve to the right and hit Florida. This was something known as the law of recurve. So they just believed that it was absolutely just physically impossible for that to happen. We now know that that's not true, obviously. I mean, even just in our lifetime, we've seen many, many storms hit the Gulf Coast, but at the time they didn't realize that. Also, unfortunately, politics played a huge role in what made the disaster so profound. The Cuban fight for independence was still very fresh in people's minds at this time. And back in 1898, so just 2 years before the hurricane struck, American blood was shed, unfortunately. A ship was bombed in Havana. Americans lost their lives. So the Americans kind of reacted in a way where they just embargoed Cuba, and that included all communication coming from the island. So this hurricane, before it reached Galveston, it actually passed over the island of Cuba. The Cubans knew what it was. They knew where it was headed. They were actually far more advanced than we were at the time in terms of prediction. They predicted that it was going to hit Galveston. But because of this telegraph embargo, they were not able to cable Galveston directly to tell them. The only thing that they could do was cable Washington, D.C. So they cabled Washington, D.C., and D.C. ignored it. They said, nope, the Cubans are hysterical. It's not a hurricane. It's not going to hit Galveston. So they didn't warn Galveston that it was coming. So again, the storm had absolutely no warning. And the science behind hurricanes was just vastly misunderstood. So when you coupled those two things with the geography of Galveston Island, which at the time was actually at or just maybe a foot or two above sea level, surrounded by the Gulf on one side and the bay on the other side, that's what led to the hurricane being so destructive.
Well, that's incredible, and how unfortunate to just ignore those warnings.
Yeah, it really was.
Well, let's go next to Charles. Charles, your novel centers around Bayou, the main character, who is a fictional character from a traditional Chinese book, How Long Meng. Is that how you say it, Charles?
No, it's Hong Lo Meng.
Hong Lo Meng. I always get that wrong.
It's
So
Bao Yu, Hong Lo Meng.
tell us about Bayou and how you developed his character based on the fictional story that already existed around him.
Well, Hong Lo Meng, to say it's a novel, it is a novel, but that doesn't quite give an idea of the extent of it. It's enormous work. In translation, it goes from maybe the shortest version would be 1,800 pages to 2,500 pages, and it has said they have 30 major characters and 400 minor characters. So it's this vast work. And yeah, Bao Yu is the number one, the major character. But on the other hand, so many other characters that a lot of the time he gets lost. Chapters can go by where he doesn't appear. So in developing his character, I had to sort of go through the novel and pick out where he appeared out of this morass of other plot lines, other characters, and everything. It sort of wasn't exactly like finding a needle in a haystack, but it's like finding quite a few needles in a haystack. And also, the parts of his life isn't really told continuously. There are parts left out, very important parts. For example, one of the key plot lines in the whole Baoyu's trajectory is that his parents want him to take the imperial examination. He doesn't want to. Well, to give away the spoiler alert, he does take the examination. And this is a major turning point. We see him, a scene where he says goodbye to his family. We see him later, and he's a very changed person. But we never see him take the examination. This whole part of his life story is left out. So I had to sort of fill in missing pieces in his life to do it. So it wasn't simply tracing, it wasn't a one-for-one copy from the novel to my novel. It was quite a bit of change, really.
Did you find it kind of your imagination kind of running wild, or was it more challenging to think, oh, where would he have been? What would he have been doing? How could I make this into a narrative around him?
No, I think the basic plot line was there. It was more a matter of filling in, well, first place, just isolating them. I did about a 20-page plot summary of the novel and sort of shaded in where he appeared in the novel. And then, particularly the examination part, there was a lot of research that had to do for that. Uh, there were with his there were just also I not only read the novel, should make clear there are two different Chinese miniseries that have been made out of the Honglou Meng, and I watched those, and they were actually very helpful because you weren't just reading about it, trying to, well, I wonder what this looked like. They actually, whether they were, maybe they were accurate and maybe they were inaccurate, but they actually visualized, and you could see what somebody thought this whole thing was. Actually, the two different series are pretty different. They visualize it differently, but that at least gave me some choice and some ideas.
Certainly. Well, let's go next to Andrea. Andrea, tell us about Margaret Jones and who she was and why did you decide to write a novel about her story? Oh, I got to unmute, ask to unmute. Okay.
Great. Sorry about that. And here is my book. I grabbed it. So Margaret Jones, we don't really have much on the historic record about her, aside from what John Winthrop recorded about her trial. There's a mention of her in Massachusetts Bay Colony constable's records. There's a mention of a woman who's being examined for witchcraft. And we assume that it was Margaret Jones, even though she wasn't named, because the timing of it just coincides with when the trial was. We don't have any record of when she came to Massachusetts. Her name isn't on any of the shipping logs from East Anglia. And so basically all that we know is what John Winthrop wrote. And then the Reverend John Hale, many years later, mentions her in his treatise that he writes about witchcraft. He actually was present at the trial and was with his congregation when he was 12 years old. They went and visited Margaret Jones the last morning of her trial. And they went into her jail cell to basically try to persuade her to confess her guilt. They prayed and they told her, this is what the Lord would want. And he was there as a 12-year-old and witnessed all this. And he said that she refused to admit any guilt. The only thing she admitted to was that when she was young, she had stolen something from a shop. But she said that she assumed many years later that the Lord had the grace to forgive her for that. But the charges that were being brought against her were completely false. She would not admit to witchcraft. So those are the only two primary sources that we have. So I thought it would be interesting to piece together the little that we had and then expand on it and try to figure out who this woman was. And also, it's very interesting that John Winthrop devoted so much time in his personal diary to this particular trial and this woman. He was very disdainful of her. It's pretty obvious in the way he speaks about her. She's hysterical, she rants, she rails against the court, she's very intemperate, blah, blah, blah. She's obviously possessed by Satan. And I'm like, wow, she really riled up John Winthrop. So I would love to find out, I would love to speculate who this woman was and kind of bring her to life so that she's not just a brief mention in the record.
Well, and speaking of imagination, I mean, you had kind of the same challenge that Charles had, is filling in all those gaps. Did you find yourself having it, was it difficult to connect to 1648, a different time, a different place, or was the human element always there and you were able to relate to this woman and what she went through?
I think common threads of humanity just that run throughout history, that was, one way to connect, obviously. Just things like motherhood, loss, love. Also, I did my master's degree in 17th century British and North American history. So that time and that era and the politics of that time has always been really fascinating to me, especially the English Civil Wars. So I love to talk about how, the Puritans were such an interesting group in many ways, but also in some ways revolutionary for the time in the way that they wanted to turn the world upside down, the known order of things. So just taking like the spirit of the era and the politics of the time, and then again, like the common threads that bind all of us.
Andrea, wasn't John Winthrop the governor of the colony?
Yes, he was the governor at the time of the trial, and he was one of the 9 members of the General Assembly. There were 9 judges that tried her, and he was one of the 9, and he was governor at that time.
He
Yes.
didn't, I mean, as governor, you'd think he'd have more things on his plate to do than just sit around
Yeah.
and be a court reporter.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I think, what was so interesting to me, like that he dedicated so much time to writing about this particular trial and this particular woman. Very interesting.
Definitely. Well, let's go to Barbara now. Barbara, if you could give us a little more of the historical context for your novel. I'm also curious, you deal with being a converso at that time. Can you tell us what that means and what the dangers were of being a converso?
Sure. The word conversos refers to people who were forcibly converted as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. So in 1492, other than Columbus sailing the ocean blue, the Spanish Inquisition, the Inquisition existed long before that. But in 1492, the Isabela and Ferdinand, the King and Queen of Spain, were given permission to establish tribunals, and they also were given the permission to evict all the Jews and the Muslims. Muslims were a little bit later, but all the Jews from Spain or forcibly convert them. So people were given a choice for a short period of time. The people who did convert were called conversos. That was the nice, I mean, now we call them that. They were called marranos in Spain, which means pigs. It was not a friendly invitation to convert. And some people converted and became good Catholics, and that was the end of their story. Some people converted but continued to practice their religion in secret. Eventually, the Inquisition kind of assumed that these new Christians, and there were old Christians and new Christians, the conversos were the new Christians, they were assumed to always be faking it, whether they were actually really devout Catholics or not. And so these tribunals began to try people, to bring them in, to torture them, to confiscate all their property. And either, if they could escape, they did. And many, many, many Spanish Jews came across the border into Portugal. Well, what was Portugal during that time? They were sailing around, discovering the world, and they really didn't want to deal with the Inquisition for about 100 years. Then, because of a marriage between a prince and a princess, part of that deal was, yeah, you got to have the Inquisition. So 100 years later, there was another major wave of Jews leaving the Iberian Peninsula. But it was a very dangerous situation. Neighbors informed upon neighbors. People were imprisoned. People were horribly tortured until they admitted. And it's so fascinating to me to, have heard about it and to listen to Andrea, because one of my characters is a healer, and she is an herbal healer and a dye maker. And the threat of her being considered, even though she was, of her being considered a heretic and a witch, was also part of this whole cleansing, to make pure Christians out of the entire Iberian Peninsula.
Did you find was this kind of shocking? Was it difficult for you at doing the historical research, and how did you manage those emotions?
Good question. Well, I'm Jewish, for one thing. My first novel, it was the life of my great aunt who lived through the whole of the 20th century in Germany. And is a very unusual Holocaust survival story. And she ended up living the rest of her life with a Catholic priest, half her age, in Germany, in the most transcendent, wonderful relationship. So I already had in my own family this concept of nothing is ever purely good or purely evil. And it's, in our modern day and age, it's always confusing to really stay in your silo and not understand. So in Isabela's Way, there's a network of good Christians helping people escape, people who don't know that their background is Jewish who discover it, and so forth. So I sort of already had that emotional thing going on about my own family. And during COVID, I got into Ancestry, went down that deep rabbit hole, and actually found my ancestor who was born in Abrantes, Portugal, and died in Hamburg, Germany. And it is that fact. I knew that my part of my family came from Portugal, and ended up in Hamburg. And that fact is what sort of started me on, okay, what is this girl going to go through, and how's she going to get there, and who's going to help her?
Well, that's so fascinating, and the fact that you're able to tie your own background, your own experience into these characters, I think that's great.
And my parents are both immigrants, so they escaped Germany as teenagers. So this has been going on in my psyche for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Now that we've heard from each of our panelists, I'm just going to post that link once more in the chat. So if you want to learn more about each of the novels, or maybe even buy one, you can go there to check out the novels. Let's go back to Jen. Jen, we talked about the hurricane, but what about how did you bring this story to life? Tell us about Kathleen McDaniel and what she went through, and how you used this character to share this history.
Well, so in the novel, Kathleen is the daughter of a wealthy businessman in upstate New York, and she's coming of age during a time of rapid cultural change. And that kind of leaves her longing to do more than what traditional gender roles at the time dictated for her. I don't want to spoil anything, but because of that kind of friction between her and her father, she ends up running away. And that's how she lands in Galveston at the time of the hurricane. And as I was researching the novel, it became very apparent that the early 20th century was a time when it seemed as if the very foundations of our country and the world were beginning to shift. We had the emergence of women's rights, we had the emergence of the labor rights movement, different things like that, where people were standing up and trying to make a real cultural change. And I really felt that that naturally lent itself to the narrative of a hurricane, which often literally washes away physical foundations. So when you have something monumental occurring that changes your footing, that changes your landscape, whether that be literally or figuratively or both, what does that look like? How do those two things intersect? How do they affect one another? And those were the themes that I tried to explore in this novel.
Can you talk a little bit more about Kathleen as a person and what her character arc is?
Yeah, well, I don't want to give away too much, but yeah, so she's just kind of rebelling against again those gender stereotypes. You know, as a young lady coming of age in the early 19th century, basically, there's a line in the book that says she's basically being bred to be a wife. She's expected to find a suitable husband, get married, have kids, and that's it. Before that end, she had been sent to boarding school. And while she was in boarding school over in Europe, she meets these fiery women who aren't content with that. They want to change the world. They want to go out and do things. They want to make a difference. So she returned to the United States, kind of longing to do the same thing. But her father obviously does not want her to do that. He's already picked out the man that she's going to marry, and this is what you're going to do, and it's best for the business. And there's an explosive scene in the novel where they kind of come head to head, and that is when she flees to Galveston. So she's in Galveston, she's hiding, she's trying to figure out, who am I? What am I going to do now that I no longer have this wealthy family to lean back on? And as she's grappling with this, that's when the hurricane arrives. Um, so now she's not only fighting for her spiritual life and her emotional life, she's fighting for her physical life now. And after the hurricane passes, there's a sense of rebirth. And again, what does that look like now that not only is who you are as a person has been wiped away, but now your landscape has been wiped away. How do you rebuild? How do you move forward after that?
So you've got kind of two climaxes and resolutions that are kind of metaphors of each other. I think that's wonderful.
Yes.
Well, Charles, we talked with you about the Chinese classic Dream of the Red Chamber that your novel is based on, but you read several of, it wasn't just the one, what was it, 1,800 pages, the one story, but you read six of them. Can you talk a little bit more about?
Six. Well, there's sort of a canon of six classic Chinese novels that range. There are various types. Where the Three Kingdoms is sort of a military epic, and the Scholars is sort of a series of stories, more or less collection of short stories. Jinping Mei is often described as sort of a pornographic novel. There are six of them, and they're not at all similar. The Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Lo Meng, is definitely the best of the six, or at least to our modern way. Although I will say the Monkey King is also very popular. It's a fantasy. It's sort of a precursor of anime, and actually San Francisco Opera is doing a opera based on Monkey King this fall. So each of them, they're all very different, but they're sort of, everybody agrees these are the six Chinese novels that are the greatest of all.
In addition to reading those, can you talk a little bit about the historical research you did to create a sense of authenticity? And even I'm curious to know more about, I know you found within those stories are some historical challenges about what's the truth of when it was written, those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, the hardest thing was to actually recreate the examination process, because everybody agrees that the imperial examination system was a key to traditional China and everything. And there's a lot about the physical circumstances of it. But one thing that there was never, I know it was very difficult to find an example of a question and an answer. What was the content of the exam? And finally, I managed to locate a reference to an obscure article in a scholarly journal that was 50 years old. Fortunately, I live across the bay from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and it has a superb research library. So one day I went over there, and lo and behold, they had this article, and there was several examination questions and answers. So finally, I had that part of my um, research done. And then I would say I also, to do this, I had to go to Beijing because a lot of the stuff, the two DVDs are not, to my knowledge, available in the United States. So those I picked up in Beijing, and I picked up another translation, which actually became my favorite translation in Beijing. And I saw some of the sites that there's actually a theme park outside of Beijing, on the outskirts of Beijing, that's supposedly a recreation of the setting of the Hong. It was built for the first television miniseries, and then there are a couple of tour sites that sort of resemble where the Hong takes place. So, there's a combination of travel and library research, and as I say, watching the DVDs. It was not any one thing. It was sort of I worked on this over years, so this it was sort of gradually collecting all the things I needed.
Yeah, that's the first I've heard of that trip you took to Beijing. I think that's incredible. I'm sure all of our panelists here have done so much work, historical novelists, to research the sources and then actually go to the sites and really you all do such a great job of recreating the history and
Yeah. I should also mention that I made two friends, student friends in Beijing. Kind of long, complicated story about how this came about. But anyway, they were involved. They served as sort of guides to like taking me to the best bookstores and taking me to the theme park and that sort of thing. So there's also people, I think you need to know people. And then I had a friend who was another Chinese student friend who was a big fan of the Hong. And so if I really became had a question, well, one example was I wanted to know how they use birth control in China, and I've never seen anything written, but he managed to come up with an explanation of how their 18th century birth control techniques. So, people, places, libraries, it's not any one thing. It's sort of sticking at it over the years, and I would say was the way I approached it.
well, I mean, good for you, and it's just another example of how in-depth historical novelists have to go to get every little detail right. And I'm sure you all know you'll hear about it if you don't get something right from someone. Now let's go back to Andrea. I'm curious to know about, you read these firsthand accounts. First of all, have they all been transcribed? Did you have any trouble transcribing any of them? And what was it like for you to dive into those firsthand accounts? Were they difficult to understand at all? Were they relatable? What did you feel while reading those from so many years ago?
Yeah, many of them have been transcribed by the Mass Historic Society. They hold the originals of the John Winthrop diaries, but there's been many editions printed of Winthrop's diaries that any of us can get. But I did look at the original papers while at the Mass Historic Society, and the Mass State Archives also is where I found some of the constable's records. So there was not really an issue with transcription. And again, because I had worked, my master's dissertation was on indentured servant migration from East Anglia to Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1635 to 1700. So I kind of had a lot of experience from my postgrad work looking at probate records and estate inventories from that time. So I was kind of used to the flow of writing and the cadence of the time. But much of it has been transcribed for modern eyes, luckily and thankfully. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I don't honestly recall, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what Charles said as having these people on the ground to kind of help. I mean, I'm sure you have plenty, especially since this is your background in your education. Who sticks out as someone who's kind of helped you through those sources?
There were 3 librarians at the Mass Historic Society who were just super helpful. They just, couldn't be more helpful than they were while I was there. Um, Also, just other historians. Most historians just are really eager to talk about the thing that they have dedicated their lives to. I mean, why wouldn't they be? So, there's quite a few historians who were super helpful in this process and just giving different perspectives on different witch trials that they had studied and worked on. Person who comes to mind immediately is a historian, Malcolm Gaskell, who came out a couple of years ago with a book called The Ruin of All Witches, which is actually a retelling of a witch trial that took place perhaps 3 or 4 years after Margaret Jones's trial in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was Mary Parsons, I believe was her name. Anyways, he was a really great resource to just kind of bounce ideas off of back and forth. So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about separating the history from the mythology that's it become of the witch trials?
Yes. So the way that John Winthrop describes the charges brought against Margaret Jones, there's some pretty wild descriptions. Some of them are very mundane, basically saying that Margaret Jones, who was a healer and an apothecary and a midwife, would prescribe a tincture for some ailment to somebody, and it worked, and it worked amazingly well. So there must be witchcraft at work there, because these tinctures she made were so strong and powerful, and they did what the people wanted them to do. So there's witchcraft. And then another charge was that somebody came to her for advice on an ailment, and she said to them, if you don't take this tincture or follow the directions that I'm prescribing to you, you'll become more ill. And they would, because they didn't do what she had suggested. And so that must be proof of witchcraft as well, because she was telling people how to take care of their health, or else they might get worse. They didn't do what she said, they got worse. So she must have the ability to foresee the future. That was how John Winthrop described it in his diary. And then, of course, one of the gravest charges was they did the examination of her, which was what was done. That was the legal process that was being used in England at the time, Matthew Hopkins' discovery of witches. So a person who was charged with witchcraft would be examined for basically 24 hours. They would be put in a room, and they'd have to sit on the floor cross-legged, and they could not move. They had to stay there and sit. They couldn't lie down. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat. They could not leave the room, and they would be watched the whole 24 hours. And they would leave a door to the room ajar, so that if the person charged with witchcraft did indeed consort with the devil and had some sort of familiar in the shape of an animal, the animal would come to them within that 24 hours, because that's the way of things, apparently, according to Matthew Hopkins and John Winthrop. And Margaret Jones had the unfortunate luck of having a cat enter the room whilst she was being examined in that 24 hours. So automatically it was assumed that this was her familiar. And then she also had what's described as by John Winthrop as she had a mark upon her inner upper thigh, which we would have to assume would be some sort of birthmark or mole or something like that. But at the time, it was called a witch's teat, that this mark upon her was sign of witchcraft, and that this is where Satan or her familiar would suckle upon. So, basically, I made a joke with somebody that if you had a strange birthmark, if you had a very loyal pet, and if you had a lot of knowledge about health and herbalism, all these were 3 strikes, you're out. So it was interesting to read how the things were described contemporarily, and then how do you write about it today? So in the example of her being accused of having a witch's teat, I describe it as, a birthmark that she was born with, that she had always had ever since she could remember. And she's like, no, I was born with this. And they're like, no, it's a witch's teat. So it was very interesting and very fun to kind of examine each of these charges and then create a story to flesh each of them out.
Yeah, like what is the rational explanation? The cat, heard a sound, maybe. I
Yeah.
don't know. Or
Right.
smelled her, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's go back to Barbara. We haven't talked about Isabela in Isabella's Way, so tell us who your main character is and how you chose to use her to tell this story.
Well, I didn't actually choose her. She chose me, which never happened to me before with any of my other books. I was on the third day of a bicycle trip from Lisbon to the Alhambra in Spain, and I was alone because of some family problems and health issues, and I was doing this warrior woman thing. I can do this, and was climbed up to a Celtic standing stone in central Portugal. Who knew that there were Celtic standing stones there? And it was like early morning, so it wasn't so hot. And it was one of those moments the sun came in just where it was supposed to. And I was kind of like, okay, I can do this. And on the way down the hill, after that very challenging climb, this girl pops into my head, a 14-year-old. I have 3 sons. I never had a daughter, so I don't know where this girl came from. I knew that she had to escape Portugal. This is before I'd done all the research with my family. And I just said, look, you got to wait. I was in the middle of writing Even in Darkness, my first novel. I knew I had hard cider in the wings. I said, you got to wait. And she did. I'm a fiber artist in addition to being a writer, so I knew that she was going to do some form of fiber arts. And when I began to think about it, embroidery became the fiber art of choice because there is a very rich history of women using embroidery and fiber arts to communicate in dangerous circumstances. Think about the quilts for the Underground Railroad that African American women did, the whole culture all around the world. Very famously from this era, Mary Queen of Scots would embroider messages to her lovers, to her supporters. She was a brilliant embroideress. So that's how Isabela came to me. And it's interesting. I did 4 trips altogether to Portugal, to Spain, to France, and to Germany in order to actually follow the path that my character takes. And one of her major allies is this healer. And so I had a lot of the same interesting research that Andrea describes about what was going on, in my case, mostly in Southern and Central Europe rather than in England. But when we talk about allies as a writer, I am not an embroiderer. I wasn't an embroiderer. And so I had to do a lot of research about embroidery. And I came across a wonderful resource and contacted that author who lives in Scotland. And she actually wrote a blurb for my novel. And I learned a lot about embroidery and actually embroidered the cover of my book. So that was one of my really fun. But I wanted to know what it was like. So that's who Isabela is. Her mother has died and she has to find her father and she has to escape people who are pursuing her.
Well, that's an amazing story, and I find not all that unusual from authors that have on my podcast who say, the character speaks to them. But what patience you showed and dedication to get that story out there.
It's been a real joy. It's the most completely fictional book that I've written. So that it isn't based, well, I got her name because at the end of the day of that bike ride, I ended up seeing an amazing sculpture that's like greater than life size. It's a beautiful statue of Santa Isabel. And she became sainted because she defied her husband in order to feed the poor. And the miracle is that the bread that would have cost her life if it had been found miraculously turned into roses. And I was very impressed by that story. And so my character's name became Isabela. But I'm sure all of us have stories of how things that we did in the course of our research just said, bingo, that's really something I'm going to use and add meaning to the story.
Mhm. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I want to invite questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just put those in the chat, and I will do my best to get to as many as I can. We also have a few viewers over on YouTube, so if you're on YouTube, I will monitor that chat as well. But I see we already have a question here from Morgan. How do you find balance between historical accuracy and your own imagination and storytelling? We have talked a little bit about imagination already. Does anybody want to jump on that question about the balance between historical accuracy and imagination?
Well,
It's
I would say that since mine's based on a fiction, I mean, how can it not be? I mean, the details have to be historically accurate, but the character, I mean, it's a fictional character, so fiction upon fiction, how you really can't, you can't go wrong in a sense.
Well, in the same vein, Greg asks, how does history help or constrain or create problems? Did any of you run into something where history got in the way of the story you're trying to tell, and how did you navigate around that?
that was something that I struggled with a little bit, especially when I started writing this book. We did not have the same political or, I don't know, social climate around refugees and around refugee stories that we do now. And so as I went through edits and so forth, I really struggled with being careful to represent. I mean, I don't know if there was an underground type railroad. I mean, obviously not railroad, but a pathway of safe houses. I posit in my book that there was. I can't imagine that every last person who escaped Spain and Portugal did it by water. Many did, but I am sure that there were overland pathways. And I posit that there were, but I was careful in my author's note to say, I do not have any evidence that this is the case. This is fictional. And to try to really frame, especially to stay factual about what the Inquisition did and did not do. That was something that was challenging for me. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about it and being careful around it.
We've got a question here from Rachel about writing a family story. How do you ensure you are kind-natured when sharing fictional stories related to family with historical roots? Andrea, I mean, maybe yours relates a little to that since you're writing about real-life people. What do you think?
I think that because we are historical fiction novelists, we do have the luxury of the fiction aspect. I think so long as a novelist is very clear in their author notes, I'm sure Barbara, I'm sure you did this, for your own work as well, and Jen, like there's just you need to acknowledge what is real and what is a part of the historical record and what is of your own imagination. As far as if you're going to tell a story about your own family members, I suppose you have to just make sure or come to an acknowledgement that there might be some people who might be offended by things that you write. But again, it's fiction. You are a storyteller at the end of the day, and it's a story that you are creating, and there are always going to be subjective opinions that disagree with the way you go about that. But I think so long as you're staying, like Charles said, as long as you're staying true to, the details, the historical details of the time, and not putting too much of a modern spin on anything, I think that, there in my own personal opinion, there shouldn't be an issue because it is fiction at the end of the day, and you are allowed to create what you want to create in fiction. We have that wonderful luxury. That, you know, which is probably one of the reasons why I didn't go on to do a PhD in history. I had done my master's dissertation, and I said, you know, I really am glad that I did it, but I felt very constrained by the lack of being able to use my imagination within that framework. So yeah, I just think that, you know, it being fiction, you know, have a go at it so long as you're staying within the historical framework.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly because my first novel is based on a family member, and 85% of what's in Even in Darkness really happened based on letters and my travel there and interviewing people. 15% is totally fictional. But the real issue is I really made sure that every living person who could possibly be affected by what I wrote read the manuscript and signed off on it.
I heard a long time ago, I was at something where Anne Lamott, the famous author, was talking. She sort of took a totally different approach to that. She said, well, if people don't like, she writes about her family. She said, if members of my family don't like what I wrote about them, they should have been nicer to me.
That's a good point.
Well,
Melissa
I
wants
wrote
to,
about people that I loved and admired, and they weren't, they'd never done anything to me. And so I think it's a great question. I can't, who is it that asked that? That's a great question, and it's an important question.
Melissa wants to know what all of you are working on. Jen, do you have something coming out soon, or are you working on what's next for you?
Unfortunately, the nature of publishing is a little bit secret sometimes. And so, yes, I have something in the works, but I can't share anything about it yet. I'm sorry.
Anyone else working on another project?
Well, I'm thinking about something set in the 1930s in Beijing with American art collectors working for American museums acquiring Chinese art, but it's very vague now.
Andrea?
I have a novel that I'm in the process of copy editing. It is due out in April of 26. It's titled The Lace Maker's Fortune. So it's kind of similar to the fiber art theme that Barbara mentioned. And I do make some lace myself, but I had to go a lot more in depth in my research. So the book is called The Lace Maker's Fortune, and it is set in Gilded Age New York City and moves to Leadville, Colorado during the silver boom. And it's about a young woman from Cork, Ireland. I'm sorry, from Limerick, Ireland, who is a lace maker, and it is the lives that she crosses paths with on her way to Leadville. So,
Barbara, do you have a project in the works?
I have several smaller projects in the works, but the next novel has not yet appeared.
Sure. Well, I want to wrap things up here. I do have one more question for each of you. Before I ask that question, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our panelists for doing this today. I want to congratulate our panelists on their new novels. They are all either available or available for pre-order because they're coming out soon. Again, if you want to check out those novels, you can go to that link that I set up, a landing page with more information and links to bookshop.org. If you can't buy any books right now, maybe your TBR is too long, just mention them or request them at your library. If it's not in your library, mention it on social media. Maybe it'll connect with someone that follows you that might be interested in these really amazing stories. So to wrap things up, I always ask, why historical fiction? I mean, Andrea is a perfect example of someone who studied history at a postgraduate level and then decided, I want to make these histories into stories. So what's the value of taking history into making it into a story, and why try to reimagine it, and what's the value of historical fiction? Andrea, maybe you could start us off.
So I was the post-grad student who was, working all day long in archives, and then at night when I should have been going to sleep, I was reading by nightlight, Anya Seton novels and Diana Gabaldon's Outlander. And I was like, wait a minute, I could maybe try my hand at this. And I think that what it is I love history. I love studying history. I love all the research involved, but I also want to feel that timeless connection that just runs throughout human history, the things that bind us together, like love and death and motherhood and fatherhood and all those things. So for me, I wanted to fill in those blanks in a very human way, if that makes sense.
Sure. Charles, you come at this with a legal background. What compelled you to?
I also did graduate work in history too,
Okay.
long before my legal background. I think the problem is really what's become of academic history. I mean, you think back, say more than a century ago, the historian, Gibbon and Macaulay or Samuel Eliot Morris in the United States, or, a lot of these historians were great to read. They wrote exciting stories and people just loved to read them. But now, academic history, is a friend of mine once said, has become your book is more and more about less and less. It becomes so minute and so detailed. I think it's, at least for me, the appeal of fiction is more a reflection of what academic history has become rather than what, history could be more interesting than it is written about today in the academic world.
Well, it's a very interesting take and one I haven't heard, but yeah, I can see how that would be true. Jen, how about you, the value of historical fiction?
Well, I think it's easy to look at the world around us and present circumstances, the political climate, all of those things, and just think there's no hope. The world is just going to hell in a handbasket and it's terrible, and there's just absolutely nothing we can do about it. And my goal in writing historical fiction is to look back at we're not the first people in history to go through really dark, challenging times. It's a cycle that repeats itself constantly over and over again. My goal is to go back and focus on those dark periods and how did people get through that? How did they find hope? How did they sustain themselves? How did they uplift others? And I think that historical fiction lends itself to that goal in a way that, as Charles was mentioning, historical textbooks just can't. Because if you're focusing on the people that lived through it rather than just the facts and figures, that's where we're going to find that encouragement.
Well said. Finally, Barbara, how about you?
So I was raised as a storyteller. I got a better dessert at my grandparents' house if I told a good story. And I became a speech and language therapist. I spent a whole career working with kids to help them communicate. So to me, the answer is always people learn and communicate story. And I love historical fiction. It's always been my favorite. It's my favorite way to learn about history. But it is, and this is pretty much exactly what everybody else has said. It's about the people and the time and the inspiration and the challenge. We as human beings, we love to learn through story. So that's what drew me.
Well, thank you everyone for a wonderful panel. Our next panel will be October 21st. I haven't published the event information yet, but if you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll get a notification about that. So thanks again to everyone. This has been great, and congratulations on your books.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been great.
Wow. Thanks, Colin.
Bye now.